Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Heretic Hammer podcast. I am your host, Marshall, and this is my co-host, Dylan.
Hello, hello.
And today, I say this every time to myself before we do. I've said this the last couple times that, like, I think this is going to be we're going to hit the shortest episode, I think, and then we end up filling completely normal times to every other episode, and it's like, okay,
everyone at home who can see the timeline for how long the episode actually is, just go ahead and smile to yourself or whatever you want to do,
Yeah. But I feel a little more confident with this one because the eliteness of this army today, of this faction, is kind of beneficial to that. There's so much that we don't know about this army still. And that is the Praetorian Guard of the Emperor, the Adeptus Custodes. They are the elite of Imperium forces. You know, what a Space Marine is to a Guardsman, there is a Custodian for a Space Marine. Not in, like, obviously the whole angel sense, but, like, in the sense of number.
Oh, see, I thought custodian like cleaning, so we're already off to a great start.
Yep, we're here to talk about the janitors of, in a way.
I feel like there's gotta be, yeah.
If you think about it, it kind of is, but it's like the janitor of traitors, space marines, demons, and Xenos that specifically attack Terra.
Specifically,
well, at least
Terra.
Now and looser now. We'll get into that. They have a funky, like, in and out kind of relationship in the Imperial war effort. But it is quite important to note the difference between a Custodes and a Space Marine, because especially recently there has been some conflating of the two and a little bit of, maybe some slippery slopeness going on. So, while Space Marines and Custodes, they are both genetically modified. They are both a type of super soldier. Space Marines are done systematically, almost kind of just like the way you could almost put them on an assembly line. And, there's one formula. You put these organs in, you mess with these hormones, and boom, you get Space Marine. Where the Custodes are all enhanced individually, each one having their own unique enhancements that make them, their own person. They are individuals. Not to say that obviously Space Marines are all clones, but they do have their own names and personalities, but to a much greater extent, of a person, because Space Marines, when you get down to it, they're still, shoved the gene seed and therefore a lot of the traits of their Primarch. So while they aren't fully clones, they're like half clones if you think about it, because they all share one specific gene, and that's the one from their, newfound adoptive father in their Primarch. And where the Custodes don't have that. They don't have a gene seed. They don't have a specific gene seed. They are just completely like when the Emperor originally takes them, back in the day when he was around and made them in the first place. There was a singular person, and he took their traits and boosted them, making them into the superhumans that they are. And so now they are masters of dueling with a vast intellect that make them peerless strategists as well as warriors. It's because of that there are inherently so few. But let's kind of get to their beginnings. Because they were developed by the Emperor prior to even the unification wars on Terra. So before Terra was even a sole, under the Imperium, under a sole banner, after the fall of the, during Old Night, when all of Earth kind of shattered into barbaric warlord states, it is just before this, when the Emperor did his unification of the planet, that he developed the first of the custodians. And they really were only short in power to that of the Emperor himself. But as a result, he could only make so few of them, especially like at that time. You know, he builds up to a decent number eventually. Mm-hmm. But, you know, they're given every benefit when he was also making these Thunder Warriors that were just like, essentially, let's just launch a dude with a shit ton of steroids and let him loose. He was a little bit more methodical with the custodians. Mm-hmm. And part of that was because he often looked to them for advice, and they were treated as close companions, you know, sometimes more so even than the Primarchs later on. So leading into the Great Crusade, then you have the main set of firstborn Custodes, which went into around 10,000, which at the time was compared to millions of Space Marines. So it was very much a good fraction.
Yeah.
You know, thus you will see the nickname of 10,000 Suns, which, given some recent lore updates, will likely just kind of be changed to the 10,000 or the 10K Legion.
Sure, that makes sense.
You know, as the Custodian Guard, they are the first and foremost loyal to the Emperor himself. So this has led to scenarios, post-heresy especially, where they are maybe delayed to act as they keep out of a lot of imperial politics, generally as much as they can. You know, they have a seat on the High Council of Terra, which has existed since the Emperor was around, but became obviously significantly more powerful when the Emperor was essentially a corpse on a throne. Mm-hmm. So because of that meant, you know, we have, you know, they did gain a little bit more power, but the Custodes, especially just post-heresy, had a lot going on. But they did, you know, an example, like a good example of that is post-heresy. There was a period of time, which we'll talk about a lot more in the episode about the Sisters of Battle. There was this tyrannical leader from the ecclesiarchy who had taken over imperial governance and was just like going batshit crazy tyrannical. You know, but they were being led, and he was kind of being defended by the original Sisters of Battle, who believed that he was an emissary of the Emperor. They decided, seeing all this happening on Terra, being like, all right, enough. And they grabbed the leaders of the Sisters, put them in front of the Emperor, which is obviously a completely rare thing, and ended that conflict by them seeing the truth and ending that whole debacle. There's a lot more premise around that, but like that, for example, I think that's about 35K. And so you're looking at about 5,000 years of random political nonsense that the Custodes just really didn't even take too much participation in. But now there is new lore which indicates that they can in fact be both male and female. This wasn't always a confirmed thing previously outside of the whole 10,000 Suns nickname, but that's one of those things where you could kind of just easily kind of toss that because, you know, it's just a nickname. But from like a lore wise, because they're always individually crafted, that's kind of where they, I guess, felt that they were able to do this. So this isn't too much of a retcon for a lot of people because, you know, people looking at it, but a good point to bring up around this is there have only been 155 named custodian characters out of the potential, at minimum, 10,000, of which there have been more than 10,000 over time, if you count all of them who have lived and died. So at minimum, that's only 2% of all Custodes, even at least firstborns. So safe to say, they picked a safe faction to be like, to pull the like, hey, this has technically always been a thing. We're just going to blame it on self-identity bias on our writing standpoint. You know, it's This could always be a marketing move, but honestly, who cares? Because, you know, the lore only exists as a marketing endeavor to buy models. You know, the only reason Black Library and the lore exists is to make us be like, yes, I have a thing to attach to with my models. So, as good as it is, it's just, you know, and silly sometimes, but that's an important note to just kind of bring up with that, is that, like, there wasn't any precedent, kind of like with Space Marines, where there is a bit of precedent to say, at least up to now, that there haven't been any female Space Marines, right? A lot of that just kind of stems to, for whatever reason, the formula he had wasn't really working with females. There's a whole potential thing that you could do, because obviously gene manipulation is a funky thing, but like, it's one of those things where obviously, like, it is a potential chance in the future, because the thing you can kind of give GW the pass on that is, we didn't know as much then about gene and hormone therapy as we do now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So
there was obviously a lot of things that maybe they didn't know. But yeah, so I think it's a cool it's obviously, for me, I think it's a cool thing to add. Because I mean, you look at custodians in general, how the hell are you going to know what's under there unless they take off that helmet?
Yeah.
And even then.
Excuse me, would you be so kind as to remove your helmet so that I can judge you based on your physical appearance? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, not even that. There's a number of sisters that if you just looked at a Sister of Battle's face, like, especially because a number of them shave their heads.
Yeah.
That, like, you would be like, I don't know. The only thing that's telling me that this is a woman is the booby press plate. And I can tell you what, a custodian isn't getting that type of special armor. Only the Sisters of Silence. Mm-hmm. But the Custodes themselves, in terms of their builds, of that genetic build, it does make them generally larger than Space Marines themselves as well. They are only by height shorter than Primarchs, which then thus are only short, like smaller to the Emperor. And there's a really great joke here that I saw a bit ago, which is that humans and orcs aren't so different because their leaders are also seemingly based on height. The taller the person is, the more power they have in the Imperium. And you know what? The facts don't lie.
You must be this tall to hang with the Emperor.
It's just like, well, because the Emperor is even taller than a Primarch, so it's just the humans just follow the tallest human. So they do have a main leader, and that will be in the Captain General, who is advised by 10 Custodes in the Custodian Tribunite. This is essentially like the Captain General is the one who will have a seat on the Terran Council. That Tribunite is kind of the General, and the Tribunite often, while they will if needed, especially on Terra, they generally will not go out into battle. From there, then you're going to get into the Prefectorate and Shield Captains. The Prefector kind of being, again, an office more than an actual like military position, where they'll do more stuff on Terra, where then Shield Captains are going to be the leaders, the active duty leaders of the different Shield companies, which are just like the sub-factions of the Custodes. So the Custodes, for all their existence, have always had a practice of their abilities through something called the Blood Games, which is a challenge where one set of Custodes will attempt to, quote-unquote, kill the Emperor in a way to test their defenses. So
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, so it's this whole game where they essentially, you'll be assigned the group that is supposed to find some tactical way to go in and kill the Emperor. And you obviously get rewarded if you were to quote unquote kill the Emperor, because again, obviously they're not actually going to. But if you were to attain that, there would be a, a reward for doing that, because you're finding a weakness in the defenses that they now can strengthen. So
it's
that is
like
a long-standing tradition.
Yeah, it's like cybersecurity companies contracting out hackers who find vulnerabilities in their code and being like, yeah, we'll give you like $500 if you find like an exploit in our code or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. No, pretty much exactly like that. And then there are still a number of Custodes that are alive from the Firstborn. Now, a large number of them, I think if I remember, it was about only 1,000 survived like immediately in the post-heresy era from the Firstborn, because there was, remember when I told you in one of the origin story or in like the origin lore episode, the overview, that the Primarch Magnus, and we also went over this in the Chaos episode, but the Primarch Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal, but instead he like broke through this like essentially psychic shield that was keeping this Webway project safe, that made a shit ton of demons enter the actual like Emperor's palace.
Yeah.
Those who did survive, though, many ended up living and are still alive in the 42nd millennium. So let's talk about how they wage war. How did they fight? Bing, bang, boom.
How do they shoot bang?
How do they shoot bang? So as to go with their kind of Pureless training, they are also fitted with some of the most advanced war gear. You know, their armor being stronger than that of most Space Marines. They'll have a more sleek form of Terminator armor, but almost just as strong, if not stronger. Their dreadnoughts, while more rare, are going to also have seemingly have a little bit more height, but then like less width, so they're a little bit more maneuverable. And they essentially, like everything that a Space Marine and whatnot they get more special versions of them. They also will get something called the Dawn Eagle jet bikes. They're from a group called the Virtus Praetors, which they are one of the few remaining jet bikes in the Imperium. There are plenty of Astartes that have access to jet bikes. You know, the Raven Wing of the Dark Angels use them frequently. It's open. You know, it's something that has some relative openness to other Space Marines, but most Space Marines you'll find end up using land bikes in terms of a bike. And so the Custodes are the biggest users of these jet bikes in terms of like, especially like on the tabletop. So you'll find that they often in battle, they generally don't work in large armies. They're usually working in, if it has to be like an actual full force, it will maybe be the most that has ever been around a fight was 1,000, and that was in a really big orc incursion, like a huge one during the Great Crusade. Like it's a whole incursion that involved this almost like people theorize, and this orc that was leading this war was a Quark that had survived, right? Like it was a huge orc, and that was the only time that they've had like that many. Otherwise, most of the time in most battles, you'll maybe end up seeing like if a few units, or like if there's a specific army of them, it'll be of like 40 or 50 of them, maybe 100 at most, you know, but otherwise, honestly, maybe even not that much. And this is represented in the tabletop pretty well. You'll usually find them in units between, 1 to 5 custodians, and they'll be complemented by this other group called the Sisters of Silence, who are not genetically modified, but they are still elitely trained soldiers known as pariahs or blanks. And this is a gene, effectively a defective gene, but one that kind of works to somewhat the favor, where they are effectively immune to the warp.
Oh.
And they're super effective against demons because of it.
Yeah.
But they're completely cut off from the warp. They have no psychic capacity. A demon cannot even reach into their minds. But the side effect that makes them unfortunate is because everybody in general is connected to the warp in some way. When you meet somebody that has this blank gene that's a pariah, you feel off about them. You look at them and it's just everything about them feels uncomfortable.
So it's kind of easy to detect know what it as well.
Yeah, I mean that part for sure. But like there's a lot of times where a lot of these people with these blank genes don't make it, honestly, even past their birth, because people, you'll get them and people will just think they're cursed in some way. Like they will think that something is wrong with them, that maybe like, because again, you feel like just they're missing something. They feel soulless. So for whatever reason, they inevitably decided that they would just make this order of silent women, where then a lot of the men will go into a section of the Assassinorum, where they become possibly one of the most horrifying in-universe assassin types, where they weaponize that blankness. They take a vow of silence as per their name, so they speak solely in sign language.
Okay.
And they only use their blank gene from the sense of just being a stalwart defense. They'll often, if the custodians are dealing with demons, they'll have a group of sisters leading them, sisters of silence, leading them from the front, kind of to help push in the demons, because if the custodians have a weak point, it is potentially psychic energies that they can't really, like, sometimes you just can't do anything about. If a demon looks at you and then just essentially grabs your soul from the inside to kind of freeze or hold you, put it in the air and make you explode like Krillin, there's not much you can do about it. But this eliteness does give the custodians, a little bit the sisters, but mostly the custodians, a little bit of Mary Sue-ness to them. They, on screen, like, they're not known for their on-screen deaths. Like, it's generally a pretty given that, like, when you see a custodian, there's a decent chance they'll make it through the end of the story. And they're kind of, the thing is, they get intrigue because they're the mysterious knowledge bearer of the Emperor, right? They very much generally are the ones that likely know the will of the Emperor, because the Emperor still is, because he's alive, he's still actively psychically active. So they have this air of mysticism to them with the things that they know about the Emperor. But they still generally are going to be like the most OP person in the room. Like, one custodian could probably kill 100 orcs and be pretty okay. It's like, all right, bro. It's like, we get it. So yeah, they get a little bit of Mary Sue-ness, which is probably where most people would not find them as attractive as characters. But other people, especially like, honestly, like, people who are a fan of like a Superman character or Superman themselves, it's kind of like, that's kind of what liking Custodes is like, right? Like, Superman is generally fairly OP. He has his weaknesses.
Yeah, and also the conflicts that he often has, or like the villains that he faces, they tend to be in a very different category above like most other heroes, like Rogue's Gallery. Like, it's because of the powers that he has, the abilities that he has, like the threats that he faces or the challenges are usually like a step above what most other heroes are able to do.
Yeah, which is honestly probably why Henry Cavill likes the Custodes the most. He'll probably play one in the Amazon series when it comes out. Probably a few. But characters are one of the bigger things that end up driving Custodes, and we're going to go over really only two because they're two of the most notable. And honestly, if you're going to, like, Custodes again are like Hero Hammer. They straight up just are like, if you wanted to, Custodes is the army to pick if you want to like dream up this lore of a dude, or even, and that being the, you know, obviously the gender neutral term of dude. Just dream up somebody, make them a character model, and put them on the tabletop. You are absolutely able to do that. Like, they are a great army for Hero Hammer. They even have a function in the game now to make them better at Hero Hammer. Like, they, like, playing characters in the Custodes is really good. There are a number of books that you can read about a number of different Custodes, obviously. They have gained a couple more in somewhat in like the modern era versus obviously the much older lore, but that's generally a good thing because modern era is generally written better. So, which is like post like 2010-ish is like the modern era, quote unquote. But yeah, so we'll start off first with Constantine Valdor. He was the first chief custodian and was a large part of the burning of Prospero.
I feel like I know this name.
Because he does get thrown around in the 40K community quite a bit. He has his own book called Valdor. It's part of the Horus Heresy collection, but still. Okay. But he was, a large part of the burning of Prospero. You know, he kind of wanted to stop Leman Russ from specifically trying to, like, kill Magnus, but his hand was kind of forced when the Thousand Suns started to, like, corrupt during the battle and all that. And it was kind of like, okay, well, all right, they've done themselves in. Here we go. So, but he set up the Custodes to really like what they are now with their whole setup, the way that they act, especially the way, you know, that they act amongst other armies and how they act within the greater imperial war effort, you know, generally kind of keeping themselves, especially into the emperor. Especially he was wounded by Horus, and so then he was critically wounded by Horus, and when the emperor was interred into the Golden Throne, he gave up his role. However, there are many, because he wasn't essentially on-screen dead at this point, many believe that he is still around and potentially just kind of working on things from the shadows. But yeah, there's a lot of there's some belief in spinning that maybe he's kind of around in the shadows, kind of helping out the Imperium. Otherwise, the current chief custodian is Trajan Valoris, and he has been the chief custodian as long as any can remember. And really that means as far as lore knows. And as far as we know, it's been since Valdor gave up his position, because there wasn't really a clean public switchover of power. So it's kind of one of those muddy things in the middle. But he is known for his keepings out of a lot of the early, you know, Terran political things. So like, especially during, like we mentioned, during the Reign of Blood, where he showed the first sisters leaders to the emperor, or allowed the custodian Longinus to go take those sisters and do that. But now he's he does a lot of work with Guilliman in the Dominus Crusade that is going out in trying to help regain lost imperial territory from the giant explosion of Cadia that ripped the giant warp hole in the galaxy. So the custodians now are a lot more active out there. And it's actually a good note with the sisters, because for a long time they had started to kind of deplete in, like, after the Horus Heresy and the Great Crusade. They started to they just kind of were getting forgot about and like left behind, because again, most of the time the custodians were staying on Terra, so there wasn't much need for blanks and fighting demons on their part. So they had started to dwindle in their numbers, some even picking up, new lives and creating offspring to try to, carry this pariah gene. But otherwise, were almost extinct until now, when Guilliman came around. They, with the Custodes now going to be venturing out, they are going to want their sisters back. So now they have come back up into full force again and are, again, very important part to the current custodian portion of the crusade. So let's talk about the Custodes on the tabletop.
Yeah, tabletop time.
So, as alluded in the lore, the Custodes are still a very elite army. So, as I mentioned, you will find them, like, if you are building a squad, a box of Custodes will be 5 models, but they're a little bit bigger in size than, say, like a Space Marine. So, and obviously, like, it still qualifies as a unit, so your value is still good. But yeah, they will generally come in like squads of 5, but like by default is like a unit. Like if you input it into an army builder, you'll see it with like 4. It's because it's like a squad of 4 with a leader kind of thing. But like they cap out at essentially being 4 or 5. Generally, I think in 10th, you're mainly sticking with 5 all the time. I'm not a Custodes player, so please feel free to correct me in the comments on that part. But they generally get really beefy gear to supplement their smaller size. One of the weapons that the Custodes are the most known for, is this essentially gun partisan that they carry. And like there are Space Marines who have used this weapon, but nowadays especially it's most notably used by the Custodians. And then obviously just they have a lot of characteristics that work them with their kind of fancy gearness. So, and that's kind of, then they get other abilities, and they're going through a lot of things with some of their defensive stats right now that are fluctuating a lot, trying to get them balanced. And they have a lot of characters that you can kind of work with. And characters doesn't always mean a named character when it comes to the game, like of 40K. And because it's kind of where the nice part of the Hero Hammer part really comes in that they're a character model, which means they're at minimum a single unit that you can put out onto the board or attach to another unit. But it means that you can kind of give them an identity and they have some extra power and all that. Mm-hmm. So they got a lot of that. So if you love Hero Hammer, like I said, great army for you there. The sisters have had a big improvement over the recent years, the last couple of editions of 9th and 10th, to go with the Custodes. They used to only have like a couple models, and then they came out with a good number of them recently. So that really helps. And also to help with that, Custodes, generally, the cheapest army to collect in all of 40K. They have the best value boxes, hands down. They always get the best discount, holiday or whatever boxes that come out in terms of value. And like I said, you don't need as much to finish the army, so you don't need as many boxes as well. There's a small problem with that, though. There's a but in that part of their story, their economic story, and that is they're the one army that still has a bigger Forge World problem. We haven't had to talk about this yet, but it's important with collecting Custodes, and that is Warhammer used to have this special site. It was called Forge World, and it was essentially the way to get special models for your armies, right? It's where you would get the biggest tanks, where you'd get, really specially created character units. And especially in a time before GW is making their models in plastic, they'd be in like a type of resin or metal even for a long time. So Forge World was like the nice fine cast resin plastic. So it wasn't as thick as some of the other type of resin that they were using, or just like it, or the fact that it was just bigger. Part of the history I'm a little fuzzy on, but what's important is that GW has started to kind of realize these fine cast kits are a pain in the ass to build, and nobody's buying them anymore, except for like especially generally older people who are really attached to really old lore. But they realized, okay, we got to move this game along at some point, and like, God, these are too much to carry around anymore. But with Custodes, there's a problem, and it's that for essentially most of their vehicles, and about like maybe a third to close to a half of their army, is technically still in Forge World. Like, almost all of their dreadnoughts are still Forge World.
Oh.
A lot of their tanks are still Forge World. They're not in normal plastic that the rest of the army is in, especially like a lot of the infantry and like the bikes are in. So that creates the problem of having to have, then, if you want to have the dreadnoughts and the tanks and all that, then those are really expensive.
Sure.
They go from being, like a vehicle a lot of times, or like a tank or something like that, maybe be around like $90 as a model, right? And that can fluctuate, right, depending on what it is. There's different things, all that, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
You're definitely not generally looking at Forge World things anywhere being under $100. And you could easily see them going above 200. It's just a part of the way that they're made and the frequency they're kind of made to order. Mm-hmm. It's the whole thing, right? It's the logistics of it. So if you wanted to expand past the infantry, you end up with a lot, then ending up getting these really expensive things. There's a good news to that, though. And it's that most of that stuff in Forge World isn't competitively viable anyway. So there's not much of there's never really a need to play it. They're by and all a flex. And that's about it.
Okay. Just to show off.
I mean, like, they're obviously fun parts of the army. Mm-hmm. A good example is one of my favorite dreadnoughts that the Custodes get is called the Telemon, and I'll be honest, parts of it are kind of stupid, but I mean, he just looks so cool.
Yeah, no, that's kind of a cool design.
There's something with 10th edition where I try not to talk too much about like 10th edition. I'll just like throw a little thing to make it like relevant now, but 10th edition is so far kind of been the imperative of the slight issue when playing this army. It's a great starting army to play with because of how cheap it is and how it plays every phase of the game. Mm-hmm. You're actively participating, but you don't have to keep track of as much. It works in so many ways. The only downside is it's always been a tough, balanced army. They're almost either way strong or way weak. They're rarely in between. It's hard for GW to get it right. They've been close a number of times, but they've had a lot of tough times balancing the army. And as a result, then you're getting a situation where they're in now, where they were openly stating when they announced the codex for the Custodes in 10th edition that they were that the codex would be a nerf to the army, which is usually the complete opposite of what you want. When you get a codex,
yeah, absolutely.
Rules you have to pay for. Like, you can't even play the game, or at least like play with all of the rules available to an army without buying it. And then what they're buying is a nerf to their army.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good, right? And obviously, like I said, there's parts of that can easily change, and they will change, stuff like that. But that is the thing you're kind of dealing with, is you're going to deal with the situation that like your rules will end up changing. Like, this number will be different every, every 3 to 6 months, So just the thing to essentially keep in mind. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, they play they're great for new players because they, like I said, they play every phase of the game. They, there's not a position that they're particularly weak at, but obviously you can still lose to like a good player by getting, just outmaneuvered and out, their tactics being better. But that's the game, right? And that's how you learn the game, is just by getting these tactics right and wrong. But they make it a lot easier because the pool size is so much smaller in a way, right? Like compared to if like you start with a horde army and you may have to like keep track of like, a large number of different model types and units. With the Custodes, depending, you can get away with maybe less data sheets at once to keep track of.
Yeah.
And I say this depends because if you run a bunch of characters, then you're going to end up maybe with more data sheets at one time. But you kind of are picking that yourself. Anything else about the Custodes you wish to know?
Honestly, not sure. I mean, I feel like you covered it pretty well.
Yeah, they're not too complicated at this point.
No, it definitely, they feel more like a, they definitely don't like rock the boat creatively. Like they're not going to be like as like super interesting as like the orcs or like the Necrons are going to be, but no, they're still...
their interest often comes in their personalities of their characters.
Yeah, and that is kind of the thing I think that is making them stand out for me as well. Like what you were describing before, that the hero hammer aspect of them that kind of makes them unique in that way. But yeah, pretty cool otherwise.
My favorite, I mean, I'm a Sisters player, so like somewhat obvious, but my favorite part of them is their interactions and the way that they work with the Sisters of Silence. A lot of people really like the Watchers of the Throne series of Warhammer 40k books. I had wanted to start reading or listening to the audiobooks of them because I have a couple from this Humble Bundle I got. But it starts pretty slow, so I'm going to give it a shot again at some point. It starts with a lot of Terran noble bullshit, and I wasn't ready for it. But, maybe it'll get better once the actual Custodes show up.
Yeah.
All right, this is going to be another week where I don't say what we're talking about next because I don't know. We'll find out next time on Heretic Hammer.
All right.
All right. Talk to you later.
See ya.